tonight, we voyage not through the battlefields, not through the castle's gloomy towers, but straight into the aromatic, chaotic, and frequently hazardous world of medieval royal kitchens, the hidden chambers where appetites shaped history. Culinary ambition clashed with political intrigue, and sometimes food was more dangerous than the battlefield. Dim your lights, lean back, and let the hum of history lull you into a world of gluttony, gossip, and absolutely unregulated cholesterol. It begins naturally with a feast, because in the courts of medieval Europe, everything began and ended with food. Decisions of war were made between courses, treaties were signed between mouthfuls, and kingdoms rose and fell to the rhythm of banquet drums and the clatter of trenchers. Our first stop, England, more precisely, the court of King Henry II, who reigned from 1154 to 1189, a man of great ambition, uncontainable energy, and an appetite so legendary that chroniclers accused him of turning every diplomatic discussion into an all-you-can-eat competition. Henry didn't merely host dinners. He hosted culinary sieges. His feasts were less about sustenance and more about political theater, where he proved dominance, not through swordplay, but by casually consuming half a deer while discussing border disputes. The royal kitchens at Winchester, his favorite haunt, were staffed by over 300 people, cooks, bakers, butchers, spit-turners, and an elite squad known as the saucemen, responsible for concocting the heavy vinegary and often terrifyingly spicy sauces that defined Anglo-Norman cuisine. You see, medieval spice wasn't about flavor, it was about power. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper were so expensive that serving them was equivalent to flaunting your nation's GDP in your soup. The more your food burned your tongue, the more your enemies respected you or avoided dinner invitations. All together at one famous banquet in 1170. Meant to soothe tensions with the rebellious barons, Henry ordered the slaughter of 1,000 deer, 300 wild boars, and an unrecorded but presumably tragic number of swans. It was said the kitchens had to import extra cauldrons from neighboring towns. The smoke could be seen for miles, and the kitchen floor grew so slick with fat that 3 cooks broke their legs before the first course. The banquet didn't solve the rebellion, but it did guarantee that everyone left too bloated to pick up a sword for at least a week. Strategy. Meanwhile, across the channel, the French kings were turning gluttony into an art form. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, reigned from 1285 to 1314. Now, don't let the nickname fool you. Fair didn't mean just, it meant attractive. Philip was reportedly so good-looking that women fainted at courtly appearances, though whether this was from admiration or the smell of boiling fish is historically ambiguous. Philip's kitchens were temples to opulence and control. His kitchen records, meticulously preserved, revealed that Philip consumed absurd quantities of meat, yet banned garlic from all court dishes because he believed it vulgar. Royal cooks had to navigate a minefield of royal preferences, seasonal produce, and shifting alliances. One slip, like serving poorly plucked partridge, could result in banishment, or worse, demotion to scullery duty, where your only job was scrubbing enormous, greasy cauldrons while contemplating life choices. The French court didn't just eat, they choreographed meals like ballets. Each course was announced by trumpeters. Dancers twirled between courses, and even the bread rolls were sometimes molded into miniature sculptures of conquered castles. On one memorable occasion, Philip hosted a feast celebrating a minor victory against Flanders. The Piece de Resistance, a hollowed-out roasted stag that, when carved, released a flock of doves into the banquet hall. Poetic, certainly. Hygienic, deeply questionable. But in medieval courts, spectacle always trumped salmonella. If you think the French and English were excessive, allow me to introduce you to the Habsburgs of Austria. Specifically, Emperor Maximilian I, who ruled from 1493 to 1519. Maximilian was obsessed with two things: hunting and food. Sometimes he couldn't decide between them, leading to the peculiar tradition of banquet hunting, where noble guests would dine in forest pavilions, while servants flushed out game directly onto their plates. Dinner was literally hunted and served in Maximilian's court kitchens operated like military camps. Every hunting trip included a portable kitchen staffed by 30 men, including a personal pastry chef who was expected to whip up delicate millefeuille while dodging crossbow bolts. His favorite dish: bear paw stew. Yes, actual bear paws. Simmered for hours with onions, wine, and a heap of secret spices that probably masked the unfortunate texture of boiled bear cartilage. According to reports, Maximilian believed consuming fierce animals would transfer their courage to his bloodstream. Modern science would disagree, but who needs science when you have 5 chefs dedicated solely to sauce production? Not all kitchen stories were tales of gluttony. Some were flat out scandalous. Enter the papal kitchens in Rome during the reign of Pope Alexander VI, also known as Rodrigo Borgia, from 1492 to 1503. Forget piety. Alexander's kitchens were notorious for wild banquets, secret assignations, and an unofficial side hustle, known as dinner politics. His chefs mastered not just culinary arts, but espionage, often slipping love notes or threats into pies, and ensuring key dishes were spiked with aphrodisiacs, because nothing said political alliance quite like oyster stew and suggestive desserts. The most infamous feast under Alexander's reign was the Banquet of Chestnuts, held in 1501. It featured, among other things, 50 courtesans dancing around the papal dining table while the clergy cheered on, roasted peacocks adorned with gold leaf, and wines so strong they were described as liquid scenes. One record claims the Pope personally oversaw the kitchen preparation, instructing the head chef on how best to caramelize swan meat, though historians debate if that's symbolic exaggeration or just classic Borgia micromanagement, as the papal kitchens burned midnight oil. Northern Europe wasn't far behind in culinary drama. In Denmark, under King Christian IV, who ruled from 1588 to 1648, food was weaponized. Christian was a man of grand feasts and grander grudge-holding. At one famous banquet, after discovering a nobleman's secret affair, Christian ordered an entire dinner where every course was a passive-aggressive jab, starting with cuckoo soup, followed by stuffed pheasant, prepared blindfolded, and finishing with pears carved into scandalous poses. The nobleman got the message. By dessert, he had fled the court, leaving Christian to enjoy the rest of his 7-course revenge alone. Christian's court employed an official master of banquets, whose duties included planning menus, choreographing serving routines, and, on one memorable occasion, arranging an indoor snowfall during a summer feast by shredding goose feathers over the royal table. The kitchen staff, numbering over 200, functioned like culinary mercenaries, ready to feed, flatter, or psychologically devastate, depending on the king's mood. Back in England, the Tudor dynasty wasn't going to be outdone. Henry VIII, the human embodiment of reckless appetite, transformed the English kitchens into gluttony factories. His kitchens at Hampton Court Palace covered over 50 rooms, including specialized departments like the boiling house, the pie room, and the disturbingly named sauce house, which sounded less like a kitchen wing and more like a medieval nightclub. Henry's appetite was mythical. Records indicate he consumed approximately 5,000 calories a day, not counting banquets or casual midnight snacks. His favorite meal: roasted peacock, feathers reattached for presentation, stuffed with rare spices, and often accompanied by drunken custard, a dessert so laced with sherry, it's a wonder the courtiers could stand after 2 helpings. Of course, the kitchens didn't just serve Henry. They fed over 1,200 people daily, meaning that managing the royal pantry was less culinary art and more logistical nightmare. Even the leftovers were political currency. Favored nobles received baskets of surplus pies and meats as tokens of royal favor, while unlucky guests were left with bread crusts, or worse. Turnip stew, medieval code for the king is displeased. It wasn't just about what the royals ate, but who cooked it. In many courts, the role of the royal chef was so influential, it bordered on dangerous. In 1537, during the reign of King Francis I of France, an entire kitchen staff was imprisoned after the king fell ill from undercooked shellfish. Investigations dragged on for weeks, revealing a complex conspiracy involving a jealous noble, a bribed fishmonger, and a sauce-maker with suspicious debts. The conclusion: never trust a fish delivery in August. As the Renaissance unfolded, court kitchens evolved into culinary battlegrounds, where flavors fought for supremacy and political fortunes rose and fell with the temperature of the broth. By the late 16th century, the arrival of chocolate, tomatoes, and exotic spices from the New World turned European feasts into experimental tasting sessions. Spanish King Philip II, upon tasting chocolate for the first time, reportedly called it the devil's brew, then promptly drank 4 more cups while declaring it a sinful delight, a sentiment shared by most of his court. The Ottoman sultans, meanwhile, were orchestrating their own culinary symphonies. At Topkapi Palace, the kitchens sprawled across an entire city block, employing over 1,000 cooks divided into specialized guilds, soup makers, rice steamers, kebab specialists, and dessert artisans. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent wasn't merely a military genius. He was also a culinary dictator, personally sampling new recipes and reportedly executing 2 chefs for daring to serve mutton on a Friday. Every day, the kitchens prepared meals for 5,000 people, with rice cooked in cauldrons large enough to drown a horse. Special occasions called for architectural feats of food, sugar castles, meat pyramids, and fountains that spouted rosewater instead of wine, because Islamic courts banned alcohol but still enjoyed liquid extravagance. As we drift towards the end of our first journey through the kitchens of history, one thing becomes clear. In the courts of kings and queens, food wasn't just food. It was a weapon, a statement, a grand performance piece. The kitchen was a throne room in its own right, and behind every great ruler was an army of chefs, spice merchants, and overworked pastry artisans, desperately trying to stay alive while serving roasted swan with a side of political survival. And yet, the most astonishing fact remains. Despite the gluttony, the absurdity, and the gallons of gravy spilled in the name of diplomacy, they always had room for dessert. Tonight, we've merely opened the grand oak door to the royal kitchens. In our next part, we'll descend deeper into scandalous recipes, food-fueled rebellions, and the surprisingly lethal world of medieval dining etiquette. For now, close your eyes, let the distant sizzle of roasting boar lull you, and dream of butter-drenched politics. The morning bells of the castle tolled once more, ringing out across fields embroidered with dew and distant village chimneys, coughing their first wisps of smoke into the air. Inside the palace, the rhythm of the royal kitchens pulsed stronger than before. Bread ovens roared like dragons at full flame, great iron cauldrons hissed with bubbling stews, and the floor echoed with the hurried clatter of hundreds of boots. Marjorie, the youngest scullery maid, darted between rows of servants, clutching an oversized copper kettle nearly half her size. The boil-over from the previous hour's fish stew had made a sticky mess across the pantry floors, and she'd drawn the short straw to scrub it clean. As she knelt, armed with sand and stiff-bristled brushes, her ears caught the rising chorus of shouts from the adjoining chamber. The arrival of the day's fresh game. In stumbled a trio of huntsmen, their arms draped with the limp bodies of wild rabbits, plump partridges, and even a prized wild boar, its tusks still stained with the remnants of a brutal forest duel. Behind them came the falconers, carrying plucked quail, with their feathers stuffed into a sack for the royal pillow makers. The procession of slaughtered bounty snaked its way toward the butchery, where cleavers would soon sing their own grim tune. At the command table stood Master Gerard, the royal head cook, a towering man with a chest broad enough to balance a soup tureen. His fingers, though thick and calloused, moved with grace across parchment scrolls, listing the day's orders. Beside him, a younger man scribbled frantically. Davin, the apprentice cook, eager and bright-eyed, despite the relentless heat pressing down on them. 7 courses for the midday meal. 9 for the evening, Gerard boomed, voice like rolling thunder. 3 pies shaped like swans, one in the image of Saint Michael, and a sugar centerpiece taller than the Duke of Aquitaine's pride. Davin swallowed hard, but kept writing, the quill trembling between his fingers. Across the chamber, ovens were stoked anew, and kitchen boys rolled barrels of ale and casks of imported wine from Florence. The fishmongers returned with eels still writhing in baskets, their bodies slapping against the wicker as if trying to escape their salty fate. Meanwhile, Lady Isolda, the chief mistress of the royal pantry, swept through the room in her dark blue skirts, her hair bound so tightly it made her cheekbones seem carved from marble. She inspected every delivery with hawk-like precision, clicking her tongue at any bruised fruit or wilted herb. Behind her trailed a smaller group, her tasting wardens, whose sole duty was to sample food at every stage, ensuring the king's meals were free from poison, but also from disgraceful blandness. At the far end of the kitchen, another world unfolded. Confectioners worked in a sweet-smelling paradise, surrounded by candied fruits, spun sugar, and great blocks of imported chocolate reserved for the rarest of royal feasts. Their hands danced over marzipan, shaping it into miniature castles and lifelike animal figures that would soon perch atop banquet tables. A young girl, barely more than a child, worked tirelessly to perfect her sugar roses, pinching the petals delicately between flour-dusted fingers while biting her lip in concentration. Beyond the confectioners, tucked near the south wall where the light was strongest, the pickle masters tended to their barrels. Rows upon rows of casks, lined with brine, vinegar, and exotic spices housed everything from pickled garlic to preserved lemons, a kaleidoscope of sharp scents that made newcomers gag and seasoned chefs salivate. Back at the center, Master Gerard took a slow turn around the kitchen island, his heavy apron smeared with every color of the day's bounty. His sharp eyes missed nothing, a slightly overcooked pigeon breast here, a toothache crust on the morning's loaf there. His bellow echoed again. Where is the herb gatherer? Have the violets come in from the fields? A thin lad was pushed forward, hat in hand, and stammered an apology about a wayward cart and a stubborn mule. Gerard waved a meaty hand dismissively, muttering about incompetent countryside fools before turning his attention to the royal dog's meal, a roast stuffed with marrow bones and crusted with breadcrumbs, more finely ground than sand on the shore. Davin edged closer to the confectioners, his curiosity outweighing his orders. He watched as sugar was boiled in copper pots, then poured and spun into impossible towers. "How do you keep it from collapsing?" he whispered to the sugar. Master, a wiry man with burn scars, tracing his forearms like battle honors. "Patience," came the reply, and knowing when to stop meddling. Sugar, like kingdoms, topples when handled too much. The door to the wine cellar swung open, and out came Mikhail, the Russian-born sommelier, who guarded the royal reserves like a dragon with its hoard. He carried a wooden crate filled with crystal decanters, each marked with the name of a far-off vineyard, each destined to grace the royal goblet by evening. Following him was a small woman in a starched apron, carefully balancing trays of carved cheeses brought in from monasteries scattered across the realm. In a quieter corner, where the chaos of the main floor faded into muffled murmurs, the sauce makers stirred their cauldrons with religious devotion. Here, the true alchemy of the kitchen, a curd stock reduced to essence, wine blended with bone marrow, and rare spices from the east infused into velvety elixirs that could turn the blandest meat into ambrosia. They guarded their recipes with more zeal than priests guarded relics. Each combination of flavors, a closely held secret, passed down through whispered instruction. From above, the watchful eyes of the steward of the larders observed from his balcony perch. He tallied inventory with the precision of an abbot counting holy beads. Salted meats for the winter stores, sacks of grain lined like obedient soldiers, dried legumes and cured fish suspended from beams to ward off rodents and thieves alike. His ledgers ran longer than the king's list of titles. The hours marched onward, and the kitchen transformed with each passing bell. Fires blazed hotter, sweat poured like rivers down soot-darkened backs, and the air thickened with the mingling sense of meat, spice, and ambition. As the clock neared noon, a hush spread, unnatural silence settling like a blanket over the sprawling chaos. The trumpeters played the signal from the great hall above. Master Gerard straightened his back, Davin tightened his apron, and Lady Isilda's lips pressed into a grim, determined line. The feast was about to begin, and the kitchen's battleground would soon empty, its warriors heading to serve the court's ravenous appetite. But before the doors swung open, before the clatter of dishes met the roar of noble voices, a quiet promise hummed through the kitchen's bones up, promise that as long as kings craved opulence and lords demanded excess, the fires of the royal kitchens would never die. In the deep hush of the ancient palace, beneath the weight of its age-darkened beams and the shimmer of 1,000 embroidered banners, life for the courtiers of the Eastern Empire continued in a strange, deliberate rhythm, somewhere between sacred ritual and whispered betrayal. The concubines of the inner quarters stirred early, before the roosters of the outer city cried, their days scripted by tradition, older than memory, their hearts caught between ambition and survival. Beneath the smooth sweep of the gold-tip rooftops, Lady Alara's world unfolded like an intricate tapestry, thread by thread, stitch by careful stitch. She had long since learned that the true power in the palace was not in declarations or ceremonies, but in glances held a little too long, in veiled words exchanged beneath perfumed fans, in the soft rustle of silk shifting in candlelight. Her place among the concubines was hard won. Her smile, a mask honed with painstaking precision. Her heart shielded by the sharp knowledge that affection in these halls was as fleeting as the morning mist. The imperial gardens, where moon bloomed beside crimson lilies, bore witness to secrets spoken under plum blossoms and alliances sealed with nothing more than a shared smile. Every stone path curved strategically. Every koi pond mirrored more than just the sky. It reflected the restless ambitions swirling beneath the polished surface of courtly grace. Alara walked these paths with the elegance demanded of her, her footsteps light, but her mind heavy with the intricate chessboard of survival. The emperor, a figure both revered and feared, was spoken of in fragmented verses and respectful murmurs. He was a man crowned with absolute power, yet shackled by ancient customs and expectations heavier than his jeweled regalia. Alara, despite her lowly beginnings in the western province, had ascended through the ranks of the inner quarters with a cunning sharpened by necessity. She understood that a single glance from the emperor could turn a servant into a queen or vanish a favorite into oblivion. She knew, too, that power in the inner quarters shifted like sand dunes, beautiful to behold, but treacherous beneath one's feet. As the midday bells tolled softly across the ivory courtyards, Alara prepared for the dance of the evening one, not performed with music or drums, but through whispered conversations and strategic proximity. Her attendants moved like silent shadows, brushing her hair until it gleamed like polished obsidian, fastening delicate golden pins shaped like phoenix wings, and layering her body in flowing silks dyed the deep red of autumn maple leaves. Every layer spoke of refinement. Every ornament concealed a strategy. She knew her rivals well, Lady Lynn, with her honeyed voice and scholar's wit, the cunning Lady Xian, whose tears could sway even the most hardened generals, the younger bright-eyed Lady Mei, whose innocence was as dangerous as any blade. They all played the same game within the gilded cage of the inner quarters, where beauty was weaponized and kindness often concealed daggers. When dusk fell like a velvet curtain across the empire, the evening procession began. The emperor would visit one of the chambers, a decision shrouded in mystery, though Alara understood better than most that the game was never as random as it appeared. The chief eunuch, the sly, ever-smiling Li Wen, held more influence than any minister. His footsteps dictated which concubine's door the emperor's path would wander towards. His whispered words in the royal ear shifting fates as effortlessly as wind moved a feather. That evening, the breeze seemed to favor Alara. Her chamber was adorned with fresh jasmine, her attendants dismissed after perfecting every fold of her gown. She awaited the emperor's arrival beneath a canopy of silk embroidered with twin dragons circling a flaming pearl. Her posture poised yet inviting, her expression serene yet alert. The knock, when it came, was soft but unmistakable, followed by the creak of the gilded door opening. The emperor entered, his presence filling the chamber with the quiet force of a rising tide. He was draped in robes of midnight blue, the imperial dragon stitched in gold thread across his chest. His gaze settled on Alara, with a flicker of warmth, tempered by the calculation that never left his amber eyes. He was a ruler first, a man second. This she had always known. Their conversation that evening drifted between poetry and politics, laughter and loaded silences. Alara listened more than she spoke, knowing the emperor valued wit wrapped in humility, boldness cloaked in grace. Her words danced around the edges of flattery and insight, offering glimpses of wisdom without presumption, sharing tales of the western province that made the emperor chuckle, his earlier tension melting like frost beneath the morning sun. But even in those moments of intimacy, Alara remained vigilant. She noted the emperor's subtle questions about Lady Lin's health, the faint trace of perfume clinging to his sleeves that did not belong to her own chamber, the fleeting glance toward the sealed scroll resting beside him, an edict perhaps, or a decree that could change the tides of the palace by sunrise. Later, when the emperor departed with a promise of return, Alara's attendants returned like silent waves, clearing the room, extinguishing the lamps, and whispering among themselves. She dismissed them with a gentle wave, her mind turning over the evening's details like a skilled gambler weighing his next move. Beyond the walls of her chamber, the court continued its restless stirrings. The Grand Chancellor plotted alliances. In the Hall of Jade Columns, the generals debated border skirmishes in the War Pavilion, and the scholars pored over ancient texts in the Library of Eternity. Yet Alara knew that the real battles of the Empire were fought within these walls, beneath painted ceilings and amidst perfumed air, where every smile could conceal treachery and every embrace could whisper betrayal. As the moon arched high above the imperial palace, Alara knelt before her private shrine, the flickering candle casting long shadows across her delicate features. She whispered prayers to the ancestors she barely remembered, not for love nor affection, but for survival, for wisdom, for the quiet strength needed to navigate the stormy waters of the inner quarters. In the days that followed, Alara's influence subtly grew. Invitations to private tea ceremonies increased. The chief eunuch's greetings became warmer. The gifts from distant provinces arrived more frequently at her door. Lady Lin's laughter seemed more strained. Lady Shan's cunning eyes narrowed in suspicion, and Lady May's innocent facade cracked under the growing pressure. But Alara remained the picture of grace, moving through the palace like a swan upon tranquil waters, her mind ever calculating, her heart ever guarded. She understood that the emperor's favor was a dangerous gift, illuminating, intoxicating, but often short-lived. She would not squander this moment beneath the shifting sun and moon of imperial grace. In the quiet hours of dawn, while the world still slumbered. Alara stood by her latticed window, watching the crimson horizon bleed into soft gold. The city beyond the palace walls remained oblivious to the storm brewing within the gilded confines of imperial power. She, however, stood, ready, silent, composed, and unyielding. For, in the world of concubines, beauty was merely the invitation to the game. The true victory belonged to those who mastered the art of survival, who danced the delicate steps of ambition and restraint, who understood that the heart of the empire beat strongest, not in the halls of ministers or the chambers of generals, but in the quiet power wielded by women like her. And so the days continued, one calculated breath after another, one poised smile following the next, as Alara walked the razor's edge of palace life. Her story, like the empire itself, would unfold with the rise and fall of dynasties, with the whispers of betrayal and the songs of triumph, always moving forward, always seeking the next moment of victory beneath the ever-watchful eyes of the imperial court. In the veiled corridors of the Eastern Pavilion, the world softened into silken hushes and muted gold. Another dawn unfolded with the same careful grace as every morning before it, but to Nari, the favored concubine of the Phoenix Court, the air whispered of shifting fortunes. The gardens exhaled the scent of lotus and dew. Courtiers drifted like painted specters beneath hanging tapestries, and distant zithers plucked notes that tangled in her thoughts like spider silk. She stood by the moon gate, her fingers resting lightly on the cool curve of polished stone, listening to the slow rhythm of footsteps approaching. Eunuchs in emerald robes padded by, their heads bowed low, voices murmuring messages from distant quarters of the palace. Nari knew each one by sight now, the older eunuchs, with their slow, deliberate gait, the younger ones eager, eyes flitting like startled birds. She listened beyond the footsteps, beyond the gossip, feeling the pulse of the palace beating faintly beneath the floors. Her rise had been like a song that caught wind unexpected, swelling with grace, irresistible. But the song could sour. She had seen it, watched women bloom like peonies, only to wither in the shadows of forgotten corridors, their names erased, their faces blurred by time's indifference. But Nari was not like them. She had learned to read the subtle shifts in the Emperor's gaze, to move with elegance that seemed effortless, yet rehearsed 1,000 times. This morning, however, there was a tension beneath the calm, a coiled thread, winding tighter. The first eunuch had arrived early, summoning her to the morning flower terrace, where the Emperor would take his first tea. It was unusual her allotted evenings were every 7th moon, not the 4th. Deviations in the routine were like ripples in still water. They meant change, sometimes fortune, sometimes peril. Her maidservant Gia knelt before her, fastening the intricate coral clasps of her gown. Neris' robes today were of ivory silk, embroidered with flying cranes in delicate gold thread. Her hair was sculpted high, with phoenix pins glinting between ebony waves. Her lips tinted with crushed cherry blossom, curved slightly not in joy, but in readiness. "Today is different," Gia whispered as she adjusted the last pin. Nera's eyes reflected the flicker of oil lamps. Everything in this court is different when it chooses to be. The walk to the morning flower terrace was a quiet procession. Flanking her sides were 2 silent eunuchs, their faces carved in stoic stillness. The breeze rustled the jeweled tassels on her sleeves. Petals drifted from the cherry trees like pale snow, and as she passed, servants paused in their chores, heads lowered until her footsteps faded. The Emperor sat beneath a canopy of wisteria, his robe a striking imperial yellow that shimmered softly in the morning light. His hair, tied in a simple knot, fell over one shoulder. His expression, as always, was unreadable in ocean, where only the bravest dared to swim. Beside him stood Lady Wei, the senior consort, her face a mask of tranquility, but her fingers tight around the stem of her cup. She was the enduring flame in the court, the matron of power, and Nari knew every rise of a new flower cast longer shadows upon the older roots. The emperor's gaze drifted lazily to Nari as she sank to her knees, her forehead brushing the polished floor. "You rise early, my lotus," his voice drifted, smooth yet threaded with amusement. "I rise with the dawn, your majesty, to honor the beauty of the day you rule over." Nari replied, voice like flowing river silk. Lady Wei's lips twitched, whether in disdain or amusement. Nari could not tell. Tea was poured, conversations turned to poetry and omens, and the emperor, with the weight of an entire empire pressing upon his shoulders, seemed content to let his eyes linger upon Nara's serene countenance. He recited lines from an old poem about spring rain nurturing hidden seeds, his words layered with meanings only the wise dared untangle. Nari responded with measured grace, reciting a verse about blossoms thriving amidst storms. The words danced between them, veiled and fleeting, like two hawks circling in the clouds, neither willing to descend first. As the morning wore on, Lady Wei's silken composure cracked faintly. She spoke of lineage, of duty, of the empresses, health faltering under the weight of sorrow. Nari listened, her smile gentle, her thoughts sharper than the jade hairpins resting against her scalp. It was no secret the empress had retreated into prayer and isolation, mourning the loss of her youngest child. And where the empress withdrew, the court shifted like water, seeking a new path. After the tea, Nari was dismissed, not back to her quarters, but towards the grand pavilion where the counselors and ministers gathered. A concubine's place was within perfumed chambers, not political halls. Her heart stirred uneasily. The first eunuch led her through winding corridors until they reached the outer chambers of the pavilion. Inside, voices argued softly behind screens. Names of provinces, taxes, trade routes whispered like ghosts. Then, her name surfaced, drifting in the wind. Nari, of the autumn chamber. Intelligence, harmony and presence. She stood straighter, every fiber of her being tuned like a zither string. Her role was changing, not merely a companion of fleeting nights, but a favored voice in the emperor's inner circle. Later that afternoon, seated beneath a willow in the jade courtyard, Jia spoke in hushed excitement. "The palace drums speak of the emperor assigning you as envoy for the spring festival rites." Nari let her fingers trace the soft edges of a plum blossom. To be seen in the temple was to be seen by the gods, by the ministers, by the common folk whispering at the gates. Her face would not only be the emperor's indulgence, but the court's recognition. But where eyes gathered, so did daggers, sharpened in envious hands. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in streaks of amber and mauve, Lady Wei's attendant arrived with a basket of lychees and a note penned in elegant brushstrokes. "In spring, blossoms thrive, but also tempt the storm. Wisdom is to bloom, but not to outshine the sun." Nari smiled, folding the note carefully. Warnings were common currency in the palace, but she knew the game was not of avoidance, but of endurance. She instructed Jia to prepare her the finest ink and paper. She wrote, not to Lady Wei, but to the elder Dowager Empress, speaking of her desire to offer prayers for the nation's prosperity at the upcoming festival. She knew the elder Dowager preferred concubines who respected tradition, who bent like bamboo rather than stood like stubborn oaks. Nari played the game as it was meant to be played, with grace masking calculation, with humility cloaking ambition. Days turned into nights, nights into weeks. The spring festival neared, and Nari's presence blossomed through the court like the first jasmine in her noticed, admired, whispered about. She danced beneath lanterns, her movements capturing the attention of scholars and generals alike. She dined within the emperor's private hall, where only the chosen few tasted the first peaches of the season. With each passing day, the autumn chamber, once a quiet corner of the Phoenix court, became a hub of bustling activity. Gifts arrived, from distant provinces silks, dyed in colors of imperial favor, exotic spices, rare scrolls of forgotten poets. Ministers sought brief audiences under the guise of casual conversation, testing her knowledge, her sway over the emperor. But Nari knew palace favor was a candle in the wind, beautiful but brief. Her steps remained careful, her words wrapped in velvet. She did not rise too quickly, nor claim too loudly. She remained, as always, the lotus blooming in quiet waters, roots buried deep, petals reaching for the light, but mindful of the shadows overhead. And in those shadows, rivals stirred, alliances whispered, and unseen eyes watched her ascent with growing unease. Yet as the festival drums echoed from the distant walls, and the sky filled with silk kites, soaring like dreams unbound, Nara's smile remained gentle, her heart resolute. The game of petals and power had only just begun, and she was no longer a mere pawn. She was becoming the queen on the silent chessboard of the Phoenix court. And the court, in all its splendor and treachery, would soon learn her name was not just whispered, it was remembered. The fragrance of incense curled lazily through the curved eaves of the eastern pavilion, mingling with the cool breath of the morning breeze. As the palace awoke beneath layers of songbirds and distant bells, Nari stood poised within her chamber, her gaze fixed beyond the embroidered silks that framed her window. The sky had shifted once more, a pale blue canvas dusted with drifting clouds. Serene on the surface, yet beneath it all, the pulse of the palace throbbed louder, quicker, and far less forgiving. The spring festival loomed like a distant storm, equal parts celebration and spectacle. And for the first time in many seasons, the Phoenix court's attention bent not toward the senior consorts, but toward the autumn chamber, where Nara's shadow lingered longer than the setting sun. Where once eunuchs treaded silently past her threshold, now they lingered, bringing messages, small tokens, words from distant voices who once deemed her invisible. That morning, her servant Gia entered, balancing a delicate porcelain box wrapped in crimson brocade. Inside, nestled upon a bed of fine gold-threaded silk, lay a single hair ornament of phoenix feather rendered in beaten gold, its eye a drop of flawless jade. Gia's fingers trembled slightly as she unwrapped the offering. It comes from Minister Q of the Southern Gate. Mistress, the note. Nariseyes.com, as still water, flicked over the parchment. The calligraphy was practiced, each stroke elegant but weighed with hidden meaning. In times of festivity, it is the phoenix who commands the sky, but wise birds perch before the wind turns. A quiet warning disguised as flattery, or a veiled threat softened by the poet's hand. Nari smiled faintly, her lips curving as her mind turned like a well-oiled carriage wheel. Minister Q had opposed her elevation in council debates. His gift was not goodwill, it was reconnaissance, a probe to gauge where her loyalties bent. With practiced ease, she set the ornament aside, allowing it to glimmer quietly, but touch nothing of her person. Power could be worn, but also weaponized by those eager to see it tarnished later. As the bells tolled the hour of mid-morning reflection, Nari made her way through the jade-tiled corridors toward the Lotus Gallery. Behind each silk screen, courtiers gathered in pockets of gossip, their painted smiles shifting when her footsteps whispered past. Lady Wei's shadow appeared first, darkening the threshold as Nari entered the gallery. "Ah, the lotus blooms early today," Lady Wei greeted, her tone sweet, but her eyes sharp. "The way a cat watches a bird preen its wings." Nari responded with a graceful bow, her voice a gentle cascade. "Only following the sun, Lady Wei, as all blossoms must." Their exchange was the language of the court, words dipped in honey, hiding needles beneath their sweetness. Lady Wei's circle of allies loitered nearby, their gazes measuring, weighing, assessing. Nari, once an afterthought within these grand chambers, now stood at their center, an unsettling presence in their carefully balanced world. As the gathered women sipped tea, brewed from first harvest leaves, conversation drifted toward the upcoming rites. Lady Wei spoke of tradition, of the Empress's sacred duties, her voice laced with melancholy and accusation. The absence of the Empress in public rites had opened a void, one Nari had been asked to fill by imperial decree. It is unusual, Lady Wei mused aloud, her fingers circling the rim of her porcelain cup, for one so young to be entrusted with sacred offerings. The gods are particular in their preferences. The gods honor sincerity of heart, Nari replied smoothly, not merely years within walls. An older concubine coughed softly into her sleeve, hiding a smirk, while another exchanged brief glances with Lady Wei. The subtle tremors of court life rippled outward, and Nari, in her youthful bloom, stood firm at the center of those ripples. After the tea, Nari retreated to the plum blossom courtyard, where the elder dowager empress sat beneath a canopy of woven reeds. Her expression, lined with decades of rule, was both knowing and tired, her gaze sharp despite the haze of age. "You walk softly, but stir great winds," the dowager murmured as Nari knelt at her feet. "My place is to follow your graces." "Wisdom," Nari replied, lowering her head. The dowager waved a dismissive hand. "Spare me the court phrases, child. You have risen because you see, because you listen when others only chatter, because you calculate where others merely react. The emperor's eye is fickle, but the court's hunger is relentless. You must feed it carefully, lest it devour you." Nara's heart swelled with both pride and wariness. The elder dowager was no idle matron, she was a relic of old power, one whose favor could anchor fortunes or sink them beneath tidal waves of forgotten ambition. That evening, within the quiet of her chamber, Nari penned letters not to ministers, nor court officials, but to the matrons of merchant guilds, the guardians of river barge taxation, the wives of distant generals. Her words were measured, her praises subtle, her offerings of silks and rare oils carefully chosen. Influence was not built solely within the palace walls. It flowed beyond them, through kitchens, through trade routes, through the unspoken alliances of women who spun the threads of commerce and family beyond the reach of imperial decree. As the festival neared, Nari's preparations deepened. Her dances were rehearsed beneath the watchful eye of the master of ceremonies, her rites perfected by the elder priestesses of the celestial temple. She visited the gardeners, learning the meaning behind each blossom chosen for the imperial displays, ensuring each petal reflected harmony, prosperity, and peace. But, as her duties expanded, so too did the murmurs. Whispered tales floated through the palace corridors that Lady Wei's brother had petitioned the council to reassign temple rights back to the Empress's lineage. That jealous glances lingered longer within the eastern pavilion, that a distant cousin of the emperor had been recalled from exile, his return cloaked in secrecy. One evening Jia brought troubling news. A handmaiden from the Lotus Gallery had been dismissed suddenly, escorted beyond the Vermilion Gates by guards whose presence spoke of quiet punishment. Her crime, whispered in the servants' quarters, had been a simple misplaced glance, minor error, but enough for Lady Wei's circle to use as example. Nari listened in silence, her fingers gently turning a carved jade pendant. The court was stirring, shifting like restless shadows before a storm. Her position was secured by the emperor's favor, but favor was a delicate thread, easily frayed by the corrosive hands of envy and ambition. Yet Nara's spirit did not waver. She had risen not by accident, but by careful steps upon a path littered with forgotten names. She would not be cast aside so easily. She summoned her small Circalgia, the old poetess Liu, the discreet steward Han, and together they whispered plans, gifts prepared for unseen allies, messages sent beneath the guise of temple offerings, subtle reminders to those in power that Nari's ascent served stability, that her fall would invite discord. When the spring festival finally arrived, the palace exploded in color. Banners of crimson and gold fluttered from marble towers. Musicians lined the covered walkways, and the scent of roasted chestnuts mingled with jasmine and sandalwood. Citizens gathered beyond the outer gates, eager to catch glimpses of the grand procession. And within this tapestry of splendor, Nari walked, her steps measured, her face radiant beneath the glinting phoenix crown. Her procession was modest, yet refined, accompanied by priestesses and senior court ladies. Their presence, a quiet nod to the dowager's influence and the emperor's trust. Lady Wei watched from her elevated balcony, her expression unreadable, flanked by ministers who whispered behind perfumed sleeves. The rites were performed flawlessly. Nari poured sacred waters upon the ancient stones, offered golden rice to the altar of prosperity, danced beneath the blossoming cherry trees in rhythms that spoke of renewal, harmony, and enduring grace. And as the emperor watched from his gilded pavilion, his gaze rested longest upon Naria's favored lotus, who had risen from tranquil waters into the center of courtly storms. That evening, as lanterns were lit and the palace feasted, Nari sat quietly within the autumn chamber, the hum of distant laughter drifting like a lullaby. Her position was secure, but the dance had only begun. Tomorrow, the palace would scheme anew. Tomorrow, alliances would shift, ambitions would sharpen. But tonight, beneath the gentle glow of moonlight and the fluttering sighs of silk curtains, Nari allowed herself a single, rare moment of quiet triumph. And beyond the walls, the empire continued to turn blind to the quiet power of a concubine who danced not only with her feet, but with her mind, who bent not with fear, but with purpose, and who bloomed not just for beauty, but for survival. The morning after the spring festival dawned with a quiet stillness, as though the palace itself held its breath. The grand courtyards, which only hours before had echoed with laughter and music, now lay tranquil beneath a soft golden light. Servants moved in careful rhythm, collecting fallen petals, straightening lantern poles, and sweeping away the remnants of revelry. But within the walls of the autumn chamber, Nari stood motionless, her fingers tracing the fine edge of a silk scroll laid before her. The ink had dried crisp and dark, written in the distinctive script of Lord Wen, the imperial inspector of the southern provinces. His words were cautious, yet pregnant with deeper meaning. The lotus carries fragrance only when its roots remain hidden. The river flows smoothest where unseen hands guide its banks. It was no mere poetic exchange, was confirmation. The alliances she had patiently nurtured outside the capital were taking root. The merchant houses loyal to Lady Wei had been undercut by Neris's quiet influence. Barge tolls were disrupted, grain deliveries delayed, and whispers of alternative trade routes began trickling through the court. The palace remained a glittering stage, but Nari had learned its true pillars lay far beyond its marble halls. Power was built on the hands that fed the soldiers, clothed the ministers, and stocked the granaries. And now, with these subtle ripples, she had begun shifting the ground beneath her rival's feet. Yet, as Nari contemplated these quiet victories, Jia entered swiftly, her demeanor sharper than usual. "Mistress," she whispered, after sliding the heavy door closed behind her, "an invitation has arrived from the Dowager Empress." To the Peacock Tea, Neris' brows arched slightly. The Peacock Tea was no ordinary gathering, held but once every year. It was where the senior consorts and favored concubines assembled under the Dowager's eye, where unspoken ranks were measured, and ambitions polished beneath layers of ceremony. Attendance was a privilege. Absence was a silent condemnation. "What is Lady Wei's response?" Nari asked softly, her voice steady. "Lady Wei has accepted, along with Lady Qin and Lady Lu. Lady Meng of the North Chamber declined, citing illness," Jia replied, her lips pressing thin. Lady Meng's withdrawal spoke volumes. She had likely chosen neutrality amidst the shifting tensions. Not wishing to be caught between rising tides, Nari inhaled slowly, closing the scroll with careful precision. "Then, we will attend." In the days leading to the Peacock Tea, Nari's chamber hummed with quiet preparation. Patterns were chosen with delicate purpose. a robe of muted lavender embroidered with cranes and mid-flight symbols of wisdom and grace without arrogance. Her hair was twisted into a crown of plaits, adorned only by a single silver hairpin shaped, like a willow branch yielding, but unbroken. Gia attended to every detail, ensuring every fold of fabric whispered humility and strength in equal measure. In the court of silken lies, appearance was a weapon sharper than any blade. On the appointed day, the peacock courtyard unfolded in a panorama of grandeur, beneath arching trellises heavy with wisteria. Low tables were arranged in concentric circles, each draped in brocades of imperial blue. The Dowager Empress sat beneath a canopy of golden threads, her face carved from the stone of years, her eyes restless, watching every entrance, every step, every greeting. Lady Wei arrived first, her entourage grand, her robes heavy with embroidery of dragons chasing flaming pearls, symbols of imperial might. She knelt with calculated grace, her words laced with reverence, her smile delicate yet sharpened at the corners. Lady Qin followed, bearing gifts from her family's vineyards, as sweet as their ambitions. Lady Lu entered quietly, trailing behind her a whisper of fated favor, her eyes watching more than they spoke. When Nari approached, a hush spread across the gathering. She bowed deeply, her forehead touching the mat, her offering Modesta rare, scroll depicting the 8 immortals crossing the sea, painted by a monk from the distant Jade Mountains. It spoke not of wealth, but of cultural refinement and devotion to heritage. The dowager's gaze lingered longer upon Nari than upon any other, her lips curling in what could only be described as faint approval, as tea was poured in delicate pastries passed. Conversation wove through the courtyard like a serpent, sometimes coiling, sometimes striking. Lady Wei spoke of the Emperor's fondness for ancient rites, subtly reinforcing her alignment with tradition. Lady Qin whispered of distant rebellions, quelled by her brother's regiments, stitching her name to tales of loyalty and valor. When Nari's turn came, she spoke softly, yet each word fell with quiet weight. She spoke of the river markets, of villages recovering from floods, of merchants returning to the capital after seasons of hardship. Her words painted not a portrait of personal glory, but of stability, of prosperity, spreading from the palace outwards like ripples upon still water. The dowager's knuckles tapped thoughtfully upon her teacup, a signal that did not go unnoticed, as the gathering concluded, and the concubines filtered away like petals caught in a breeze. Nari found herself summoned into the inner chamber of the dowager, a rare and intimate audience. Within the shaded sanctuary, amidst tapestries depicting the founders of the dynasty, the dowager spoke directly. "You wear humility like armor, girl," she said, her voice as brittle as dried leaves. "But you must not forget, armor can weigh you down." "I have only followed your grace's wisdom," Nari replied softly. The dowager studied her for a long moment. "You have no family in court, no powerful house to shield you, and yet you stand, defying the tides that swallowed stronger names before you. The Emperor's favor is a fickle wind, child. You must root yourself deeply, lest you be uprooted by the next storm." "I seek only to serve the Empire," Nari answered, carefully. The dowager's smile did not reach her eyes. A wise answer, perhaps too wise. She gestured toward a lacquered box resting beside her. "Inside is a talisman imperial, blessing reserved for those whose presence steadies the court. It has not been granted in many seasons. I entrust it to you, but heed this. Those who rise quickly cast long shadows, and the court remembers shadows more than light." With steady hands Nari accepted the gift, bowing low in silent gratitude. But beneath her calm expression, her heart tightened. The dowager's gift was both shield and brand, a mark of imperial acknowledgement, but also a target for jealous eyes. The days that followed reflected the subtle shift. Eunuchs bowed deeper when passing her chambers. Ministers included her name in ceremonial rites, and even Lady Wei's sharpest tongues softened, though their smiles thinned. But peace within the court was as transient as morning mist. Whispers arose of new edicts concerning temple revenues, of military appointments altered, of the emperor requesting frequent councils without the dowager's oversight. The tides, which had briefly stilled, began to churn once more. Late one evening, Nari walked through the quiet plum-blossom courtyard, her thoughts heavy. She met with Han, her discreet steward, who carried fresh tidings. Lady Qin's brother is petitioning for a new military governor in the southern provinces. Han murmured, and Lady Wei has secured a rare jade tribute from the western hills. Nara's lips pressed thin. The game had entered its next turn. Send word to Lord Wen, she instructed. Remind him that the flood walls near the southern delta still require imperial funds. Suggest that delaying these funds may inspire local unrest. Unless certain governors act swiftly. She glanced toward the horizon, where the moon was climbing high above the curved roofs of the imperial city, and reach out to Lady Meng's household. She added, offer them an exclusive trade route for medicinal herbs. Quietly. No banners. No proclamations. Han bowed deeply, his voice filled with understanding. It will be done, mistress. As the night deepened, Nari returned to her chamber, standing beneath the soft glow of an oil lamp. Her reflection stared back from the polished bronze mirror. Woman neither naive nor corrupted, but honed by necessity. Her path had been carved by patience, her steps measured by strategy, her presence sharpened by survival. She no longer merely navigated the storm, she orchestrated it. Tomorrow, the court would continue its endless dance of smiles and secrets. Tomorrow, schemes would bloom like poisonous flowers. But Nari stood prepared, her heart a quiet furnace of resolve, her mind an ever-turning wheel of calculation. In the empire of silk and steel, she had learned the most precious art of all to wield influence with an invisible hand, and to make survival an unbroken song amidst the thunderous chorus of ambition. And so, the palace breathed and stirred, a world of endless beauty and hidden peril, and Nari moved within it as both blossom and blade. Spring surrendered to the early hush of summer, and with it, the palace shifted its rhythm. The blossoming courtyards gave way to shaded pavilions. The court's music softened beneath the weight of rising heat, and the very air seemed steeped in a drowsy, golden slumber. But beneath the sleepy veneer, the pulse of ambition throbbed louder, unseen but relentless, in the secluded quiet of the autumn chamber. Nari sat before a freshly painted map of the empire, delicate ink strokes out the territories where her influence now flowed. It was no longer a quiet trickle. It was becoming a river. Jia adjusted the blinds, letting through only slivers of sunlight, as she reported. Lady Qin has secured her brother's appointment, but there is unrest in the southern towns. Merchant complaints have begun to echo. In the Ministry of Trade. Nari nodded. The grain shipments delayed, Jia replied. Lord Wen's efforts to redirect trade are working. Lady Wei's merchant allies grow restless. Some have started approaching intermediaries for new contracts. Nara's hand remained steady, fingers brushing against the lacquered edge of the table. Influence was measured not in titles, but in who controlled the flow of silver and rice. Her web tightened quietly around her rivals, unseen yet unmistakable in its constriction. A knock echoed firm, controlled. Han entered, his footsteps soundless on the polished wood. Mistress, he began, there has been a change within the North Chamber. Lady Meng has recovered miraculously and has been summoned to the Emperor's evening feast. Nara's gaze sharpened, an old illness cured by opportunity. Precisely, Han replied with the faintest smile. Moreover, Lady Wei has secured an invitation to the Summer Tribute Review, presenting the Emperor with rare gemstones acquired from the Western Hills. Nara's lips pressed together, contemplative. The Summer Tribute Review was more than a formal display of wealth. It was a stage where influence could be rekindled under the Emperor's watchful eye. A single dazzling gift could shift the Emperor's fickle favor, undoing months of quiet maneuvering. But every gift bore a cost, and Nari intended to raise it. "Summon the steward of the Eastern Market," she instructed. "He will make contact with the jewel merchants. The finest stones are to be delayed at the checkpoints, their passage slowed by unexpected assessments. And if the Ministry of Trade intervenes," Han asked. "Then we will offer solutions," Nari replied smoothly. "Our warehouses will just happen to have reserves ready, at reasonable prices, of course." Her strategy was water flowing around stones, flexible, persistent, impossible to grasp, yet capable of reshaping the hardest granite over time. As the day waned, Nari retreated to her private garden, letting her senses settle amidst the quiet chirping of cicadas and the scent of ripening plum blossoms. Here, beneath the quiet canopy of green, she contemplated not only court politics, but survival itself. Her life in the autumn chamber had begun as a song of endurance, each verse written in careful whispers, each stanza sealed in silence. But now, her presence vibrated across the marble halls, rippling through the silk screens, threading itself into the murmur of court life. Later, at the Emperor's evening feast, Nara's place was not at the Emperor's immediate side, but it was within the golden circle of influence. She observed the room, noting the subtle lines drawn in the placement of cushions, in the order of wine pouring, in the length of courtesies paid. Lady Wei dazzled in robes of crimson and gold, her laughter ringing like silver bells. Beside her, Lady Qin leaned forward, eyes bright with rehearsed charm. Lady Meng returned from her illness, spoke softly, but with a renewed confidence, carefully re-establishing her forgotten relevance. But Nari, clad in the simplest silk of moonlight white, remained calm. She listened, she smiled, and she remembered. Her power did not bloom in public. Display thrived in the shadows cast by such spectacles. As the banquet wore on, the Emperor, clad in imperial yellow and fragrant with sandalwood oil, called upon Nari to recite a verse. With modest grace, she stepped forward, choosing not the famous courtly poems, but the old verses sung by the river bargemen. Her voice flowed like a quiet stream, humble in tone, yet rich with the rhythm of the land beyond the palace walls. When she finished, the Emperor nodded, a rare softness in his gaze. Others smiled politely, but Nari noted the flicker of irritation in Lady Wei's eyes, the concealed tightening of Lady Qin's jaw. They had performed for grandeur. She had spoken for the heart of the empire. And that night, as the stars stretched across the inky sky, Han returned with word that the Emperor had ordered additional resources directed toward the flood-prone villages. Nari had mentioned in her poem, she had learned long ago, favor was never won in the throne room. It was gathered quietly, like dew in the early dawn, until it formed a river none could resist. Days turned into weeks, and with each court ceremony, Nari's shadow lengthened. Eunuchs paid closer attention. Minor officials began sending her letters of petition. Even seasoned ministers whispered her name in discussions of stability. Yet she remained measured. Each rising tide brought its own storms. One such storm gathered quietly, its first rumblings delivered in the form of a sealed letter, unmarked but carrying the fragrance of sandalwood unique to the inner counselor. Message from the Emperor himself. Jia brought it with reverent hands, her eyes wide with curiosity. Within, the Emperor spoke not of courtly affairs, but of deeper matters of unrest in the distant northern provinces, of brewing discontent among border generals, and of his intent to dispatch a discreet envoy, unnamed, to investigate and report directly to him. At the bottom of the scroll, a simple instruction. Your wisdom has steadied the court. Let it now steady the realm. The weight of the message pressed upon Nari like a silken chain. It was both an elevation and a test. To step beyond the palace gates meant new opportunities, but it also exposed her to dangers far greater than whispered court intrigues. Yet hesitation was a luxury she could not afford. That evening, beneath the watchful moon, she met with Han and Jia in the privacy of the eastern veranda. "We will prepare to depart," she announced softly. "Gia, you will remain within the palace, eyes and ears open. Han, you will accompany me. And Lady Wei," Han asked. "She will rejoice at my absence," Nari replied, "but the roots we've planted will continue to grow in this soil. Our absence will not be emptiness, it will be quiet preparation." For the first time in many seasons, Nari looked beyond the marble walls and lacquered gates, toward the distant mountains and restless rivers. Her journey through the empire had begun in a confined chamber, her influence blooming behind silk screens. Now, it was time to carry that influence beyond, to shape the shifting currents of the realm itself. As the palace prepared for another cycle of ceremonies, Nari prepared for something far greater, a silent march through lands whispered of in scrolls, a confrontation not just with court rivals but with the pulse of the empire's heart. Her path remained veiled in uncertainties, but her resolve was clear. The woman who had once merely endured would now command, not through force or fury, but through the subtle, enduring power of insight and patience. In the grand, breathing entity that was the Celestial Empire, she would be a quiet, force-steady, unseen, and unstoppable. And as the palace walls faded behind her, Nari stepped into the unknown, where destiny awaited beyond the horizon, as vast and unpredictable as the wind that rustled through the ancient banners of the empire. In the velvet hush of the royal corridors, where stone walls murmured with the secrets of 100 years, the great halls of Europe continued their slow, intoxicating dance of grandeur and ruin. The tapestries swayed gently from forgotten drafts. The waxy glow of candelabras stretched their light across flagstones polished by footsteps, both regal and wicked. And within these sprawling estates of majesty, beneath gilded crowns, and beneath the suffocating weight of dynasties, the parade of obsession, lust, and misrule marched on. It was in Burgundy, that wealthy jewel nestled between France and the Holy Roman Empire, where Philip the Good carved out his name, and quite a few hearts, during the early 15th century. His rule from 1419 to 1467 was a masterpiece of statecraft, art patronage, and absolutely reckless indulgence. Burgundy flourished, its courts gleaming with sophistication, its treasuries swollen with coin, and yet, its bedrooms resembled more a raucous tavern than a sanctum of governance. Philip's ascension was marred by blood, for he inherited the title after his father, John the Fearless, was murdered on the bridge at Montereau. Vengeance painted Philip's early reign, and while his soldiers marched and his banners flared crimson against the wind, his knights were devoted to more carnal conquests. Chroniclers whispered that Philip kept a ledger not only of his territorial gains but of his romantic exploits, a list that grew faster than his dominions. Philip's mistresses were many, varied, and frequently recorded with alarming detail. They were not merely fleeting passions, they were fixtures in courtly life. Among the most infamous was Jeanne de Pressel, a woman of sharp wit and sharper ambition. She arrived at court with modest means, but left as the mother of ducal bastards, endowed with estates richer than many barons. Jeanne was not an exception, but a template. Philip's affairs became a part of diplomatic fabric, with nobles sending their daughters not just to serve, but to seduce, eager to entangle themselves within the opulent tapestry of the Burgundian court. The duke's weddings were political necessities, but his lovers were his true companions. His first marriage to Michelle of Valois served the French alliance. His second, to Bonaventure, patched regional fractures, and his third, to Isabella of Portugal, produced heirs of dynastic significance. But it was in the shadows of the bedchamber where Philip's heart truly danced, rarely in the marital embrace, but often in the warmth of his mistress's arms. Isabella, a woman of remarkable intellect and iron composure, tolerated her husband's escapades with the stoicism of royalty. But her court became a minefield of jealousy and veiled contempt. The Duchess adorned herself with jewels from Lisbon and robes of Flemish silk. But even her splendor could not extinguish Philip's appetite. He once joked that a prince must hunt, feast, and love with equal vigor, a sentiment that ensured many a harried chamberlain was left sorting out the complications of too many pregnancies and too few legitimate heirs. Philip's court, however, was more than a haven for whispered seductions. It was a cultural beacon, a sanctuary for poets, painters, and musicians. Under his patronage, Flemish artistry flourished. Tapestries bloomed with vibrant threads, manuscripts gleamed with golden ink, and the walls sang with polyphonic harmonies. Yet behind every artistic commission, every grand festival, was an undercurrent of indulgence that threatened to upend propriety itself. The Feast of the Pheasant, in 1454, stood as a monument to this intoxicating blend of piety and pleasure. Ostensibly a call to arms for a crusade against the Ottoman Turks, it became a bacchanalia of excess. Exotic animals paraded through the banquet halls, musicians played until their fingers bled, and wine fountains flowed so freely that even the most stoic knights found themselves swaying like reeds in a storm. Beneath the golden arches of the banquet chamber, oaths of war were mingled with declarations of forbidden love, and alliances were forged, not just with words, but with lingering glances and whispered promises behind velvet curtains. Even as Philip expended his duchy's wealth and power, his private affairs tangled like ivy around his legacy. His bastards, of which there were many, were not relegated to the shadows. They bore titles, commanded estates, and married into noble families. Their origins whispered, but their influence undeniable. The legitimate offspring grumbled, courtiers gossiped, and visiting ambassadors marveled at how the Duke could hold a council meeting in the morning, attend mass in the afternoon, and father another child by nightfall. Behind closed doors, rivalries festered. The noble ladies who warmed Philip's bed also sharpened their tongues against one another. Poisonous gifts exchanged hands. Servants carried both love letters and veiled threats. And the undercurrent of lust was matched only by the ever-present scent of ambition. The Duchess's ladies-in-waiting became messengers, spies, and sometimes casualties in a war of hearts that raged silently through the marbled corridors. And yet, amidst this symphony of scandal, Burgundy prospered, cities expanded, markets brimmed with goods from across Europe, and the Burgundian army strutted across battlefields with unmatched pomp. It was a paradox that confounded many. How could a ruler so ensnared by personal vices command such public success? Perhaps it was Philip's unrelenting charisma, a force so magnetic that even his adversaries found themselves reluctantly charmed. Perhaps it was the meticulous administration that thrived despite, or because of, his distractions. Or perhaps it was the enduring power of wealth, which smoothed over the roughest of indiscretions, and gilded the most scandalous of tales. As age crept upon him, Philip showed no sign of repentance. His hair grayed, but his appetites remained youthful. His flesh softened, but his eyes still sparkled with mischief. Isabella, older and wiser, ruled the court with quiet dignity, but the parade of young women did not cease. Priests preached temperance, advisors counseled restraint, but the Duke simply smiled, raised his goblet, and indulged anew. In the winter of his years, Philip often retreated to his grand palace at Bruges, its spires piercing the sky like the ambitions of his lineage. Here, amidst the canals and the merchants, the Duke held court one final time. The halls echoed with laughter, the cellars ran dry from toasts, too numerous to count, and the embers of countless love affairs glowed faintly behind the cold stone walls. When he finally passed in 1467, Philip left behind a duchy at the zenith of its glory, and a court scandalized beyond compare. Chroniclers debated whether he should be remembered as the architect of Burgundian splendor, or as its most debauched sovereign. But for those who had walked those marbled halls, who had seen the candlelight flicker across silken sheets, there was little doubt. Philip the Good was aptly named, for he was good at ruling, good at loving, and unrivaled in his pursuit of life's most intoxicating pleasures. And thus, In the annals of medieval grandeur, his name endured, embroidered into tapestries, carved into stone, and whispered in the night, a reminder that beneath every crown, there often lies a heart swayed by passions more powerful than kingdoms. In the final chapter of Burgundy's Gilded Age, the grand halls that once rang with music, laughter, and the soft echoes of whispered intrigue stood witness to a transformation neither swift nor quiet, but inevitable as the turning of the seasons. Philip the Good, whose shadow had loomed large over courts and countrysides alike, had returned to the earth, leaving behind a kingdom swollen with wealth, tangled in ambition, and thirsting for continuation of its magnificence. Into this world strode Charles the Bold, the Duke's only legitimate son, forged in steel rather than silk. His eyes colder than the northern winds that swept the Burgundian plains. Where his father had reveled in the velvet softness of indulgence, Charles carried the iron resolve of conquest. The courtiers who once danced between the affections of the late Duke now stood straighter, their smiles more reserved, their steps cautious on marble floors that once bore witness to feasts of unmatched excess. But even the fiercest flames cannot burn without feeding on what came before, and Charles's court inherited more than just a treasury bursting at its seams. It inherited the echoes of Philip's pleasures, bastards with noble blood and hungry ambition, alliances built on affection rather than treaties, and a court accustomed to the rhythms of seduction far more than the discipline of strategy. Charles sought to forge a new Burgundy, a kingdom standing toe-to-toe with France and the Holy Roman Empire, a third power crowned not by wine goblets but by glinting swords. His days were filled with councils, his nights with military strategy, and his dreams were steeped in imperial visions. He married Margaret of York, a woman of sharp intellect and unwavering loyalty, hoping to weld English might to his continental ambitions. His court, once scented with perfume and dulled by endless banquets, now rang with the clatter of armor, the gruff voices of mercenary captains, and the stern proclamations of reform. But while Charles plotted wars and fortified his borders, the bloodline Philip had so generously scattered among the noble houses began to bubble beneath the surface. Distant cousins eyed estates that should have been theirs. Bastards grown into men whispered claims to influence, and the courtiers, starved of indulgence and weary of endless campaigns, yearned for the reckless pleasures of the old days. The splendor of Burgundy began to fracture from within, even as Charles marched to expand it from without. The ghosts of Philip's reign lingered in the perfumed corridors, in the laughter that returned only after the Duke had retired to his maps, and in the desperate marriages hastily arranged to secure legitimacy in a court where lineage had become a dangerous weapon. The painters who once chronicled joyous hunts now captured battles drenched in blood. The musicians who once played beneath moonlit balconies now composed dirges for fallen knights. The lavish halls that once echoed with merriment became gaunt with the weight of ambition. Charles's wars were many against the Swiss, against the French crown, against the tides of history that refused to bend to a single man's will. He fought at Grandson, at Merton, and finally, at Nancy. It was there, in the bitter winter of 1477, that Burgundy's fate was sealed. The fierce dreams of empire collided with the brutal reality of alliance and resistance. Charles, armored and defiant, fell in the snows, his corpse stripped of its grandeur, his dreams shattered amidst the frozen soil. With his death, the duchy that Philip had built and Charles had tried to immortalize crumbled like dry parchment. The once proud Burgundy was divided between opportunistic neighbors. France swallowed parts whole, the Holy Roman Empire claimed its share, and the glittering court that had once dazzled Europe was left to history, its chandeliers dimmed, its tapestries tattered, its halls silenced. The bastards Philip had sired vanished into obscurity, or fled to lesser courts where their lineage was more curiosity than claim. The noble families that had thrived in the warmth of his favor found themselves adrift in a kingdom without a master. The poets packed away their quills, the painters their brushes, and the songbirds that once serenaded mistresses in hidden alcoves now sang to empty gardens. And yet, in the fading light of Burgundy's twilight, there remained an undeniable truth. For decades, amidst the iron-fisted empires and austere monarchies, there had existed a domain where joy reigned as fiercely as politics, where laughter dueled ambition, and where pleasure carved a place for itself beside power. Philip the Good's legacy was more than just land and coin. It was a reminder that courts could be alive, that rulers could be flawed and magnetic, and that history was written not just in treaties and battles, but in the stolen glances across banquet halls, in the whispered promises beneath gilded ceilings, and in the human heart's relentless chase of beauty, folly, and desire. Burgundy, as a sovereign entity, fell, but its legend endured. Chroniclers wrote of its golden age, playwrights captured its scandalous romances, and artists resurrected its splendor in brushstrokes of crimson and gold, in every crumbling manor house where a faded crest bore Philip's symbol, in every marketplace where merchants still whispered of Burgundian wealth, and in every love story where passion defied duty, the spirit of Burgundy lived on. And so, through the mists of time, the tale of a court both magnificent and scandalous whispered through history, a testament to the fleeting but unforgettable reign of indulgence amidst an age of iron, a reminder that even amidst crowns and conflicts, the heart would forever dare to rule. The grand saga of Burgundy closed its chapter, leaving only echoes and the eternal shimmer of a forgotten age.